So if you think about the supply market, the driver market, when we entered 2020, we had a drug and alcohol clearinghouse that went into effect. And as of recently, we have about 35,000 drivers that are now in that database that essentially can be excluded from being hired. They can go through a process to get reinstated, but for the most part, what we're seeing is drivers are not doing that. And so I would say about 35,000 drivers are excluded from being hired. Now that's out of 4 million drivers that say have a CDL. So that may seem like a big number, but think of the truckload market, all these other guys that are on here, they're from a driving hiring perspective, they're in a lot better position because the jobs that require CDL, they're much more attractive in the LTL segment or the private fleet or any of the package and any of that's required. Those are more desirable jobs. And unfortunately, the bottom of the totem pole is truckload. And so when you have drivers come out of the overall segment, they typically come out of truckload. Even if they come out of, let's say an LTL driver fails a drug test, then you have a truckload driver probably move upstream to take that job. So the sheer numbers always come out of the truckload. And that's why the truckload industry is so volatile from that perspective. So 35,000 there. And then when we had a shutdown in March and April, many of the truck driving schools were not deemed essential. And so many of them were shut down anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And why that's significant, again, if you go back to that 4 million CDL holders, there are people retiring every single year and to the tune of probably a couple 100,000 people that are leaving the industry, whether it be retirement or sick or want to be home. I mean, what have you, they're leaving the industry. And so the influx of new people coming into the industry are coming in through that new CDL driving school. So with those being shut down for 6 to 8 weeks, the pipeline wasn't getting filled up. And I would actually argue that things were actually accelerating on the retirement side because of concerns about COVID and illnesses and things. You had more people leaving. And the reason that not only were the schools shut down, but then you had the outsized unemployment benefits in the stimulus bill. So not only did you have the school shut down, but when they opened back up, we didn't necessarily have this influx of new people like we typically do when there's high unemployment. Unfortunately, our industry is a job of last resort in a lot of cases. So when high unemployment's there, you see people run into the industry. You didn't see that this time, partially because of those unemployment benefits. And now that the schools are open, they're running at, say, half capacity because of social distancing and those type of things. So to date, we've seen about 100,000 less CDLs issued by states than what we saw last year. And then I estimate that as we go through the balance of the year, there's probably about another 50,000 that will be of a deficit versus the back half of 2019 from a CDL perspective. So let's say there's 150,000 less CDLs issued. I figure there's another 20,000 or so drivers that go into the alcohol and drug clearinghouse. And so I think it's likely we will exit 2020 with 200,000 less drivers than we entered 2020 with. Now, drivers and trucks aren't exactly, they're two different things. So when I talked about 40,000 trucks that moved the market from, say, 17 and 18 into 19, we're talking about drivers. So it's a little different, but the drivers are kind of the lead that obviously requires you to have in order to have the truck. So I don't think there's 200,000 less trucks in the market, but there could very well be by the end of this year, 50 or even 100,000 less because of that driver situation. I think people would ask, but how do we fix this? Unfortunately, I don't know that there's a near-term quick fix. One of the things that you're going to see over the next couple of quarters, and you're already starting to see the early part of that, is driver wage increase. And when I'm talking about driver wage increases, in the past, they've been kind of the variety of a 5-7% driver wage increase, meaning, they give a penny here, a penny there, that kind of a thing. We're talking about significant driver wage increases, probably closer to the tune, when it's all said and done over the next couple of quarters, of closer to 20%. Where I think that some have given 10%. I think likelihood there will be probably 2 or 3 legs of this, where you'll see maybe a 10 and then a 5 and a 5, or you may see somebody go in all in 20. But I think that you're going to be close to that 20% when it's all said and done in the near term. What that gets you is essentially a reshuffling of the deck. It's not going to get you any new drivers, most likely, maybe a few here and there. Maybe a couple that have left the industry will come back to the industry, but you're not probably convincing that guy who's in construction to all of a sudden join the trucking industry. We're not there yet. And so all that's really going to do is reshuffle the deck. One thing for customers to think about is driver wage cost is about 1/3 of our overall cost. So if you think if we have to give a say it's 21% for easy math, 21% increase to drivers, then that's essentially an increase of our cost of 7%. So when Mike was talking about rates having to go up 8 to 10%, you're talking 7% of cost increase just on the driver wage piece alone. You start to look at the inflation we've seen over the last couple of years. You start to look at the fact that we've had downward rate pressure for probably 2 bid cycles. And I think rates, I would probably argue with Mike, I think we're probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% that will be needed through this bid season going forward, partially because of the 7% from the driver wage increase, which is pretty significant. And again, as I mentioned, that 20% isn't going to get you new drivers. So if you ask me, what is it going to take to really fill that deficit of 200,000, I think you're probably talking closer to 40 to 50%, which we're not going to do in this cycle. But I think that that there's a real reason that we're not going to be able to fix this deficit in the near term, because we've got to bring a whole new group of people into the industry. And I don't see a catalyst for that happening unless there becomes an appetite for a 40 or 50% increase. And I think there would have to be a situation where you're talking about, thousands and tens of thousands of loads sitting on docks, not getting picked up for days or weeks at a time before we even got into that scenario. But I think that we're probably going to look at probably one of the tightest truckload markets that we've seen for at least the next 6 to 18 months. And also, if you look back at 17 and 18, it was a 6-quarter cycle. Typically, that's what you see in those strong cycles, about 6 quarters. I think this one has the potential to last 12 to 14 quarters.